Section 27 of After Dark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Molly Craig. After Dark by Wilkie Collins. The Angler's Story of the Lady of Glenwith Grange, Part 2. The only joyless face at the Grange now was Ida's. At any time it would have been a hard trial to her to resign that first and foremost place which she had held since childhood in her sister's heart, as she knew she must resign it when Rosamond married. But secretly disliking and distrusting Franval as she did, the thought that he was soon to become the husband of her beloved sister filled her with a vague sense of terror which she could not explain to herself, which it was imperatively necessary that she should conceal, and which on those very accounts became a daily and hourly torment to her that was almost more than she could bear. One consolation alone supported her. Rosamond and she were not to be separated. She knew that the baron secretly disliked her as much as she disliked him. She knew that she must bid farewell to the brighter and happier part of her life on the day when she went to live under the same roof with her sister's husband. But, true to the promise made years and years ago by her dying mother's bed, true to the affection which was the ruling and beautiful feeling of her whole existence, she never hesitated about indulging Rosamond's wish when the girl, in her bright, light-hearted way, said that she could never get on comfortably in the marriage state unless she had Ida to live with her and help her just the same as ever. The baron was too polite a man even to look dissatisfied when he heard of the proposed arrangement, and it was therefore settled from the beginning that Ida was always to live with her sister. The marriage took place in the summer, and the bride and bridegroom went to spend their honeymoon in Cumberland. On their return to Glenwith Grange, a visit to the baron's sisters in Normandy was talked of, but the execution of this project was suddenly and disastrously suspended by the death of Mr. Welwyn from an attack of pleurisy. In consequence of this calamity, the projected journey was of course deferred, and when autumn and the shooting season came, the baron was unwilling to leave the well-stocked preserves of the Grange. He seemed, indeed, to grow less and less inclined, as time advanced, for the trip to Normandy, and wrote excuse after excuse to his sisters, when letters arrived from them urging him to pay the promised visit. In the winter time, he said he would not allow his wife to risk a long journey. In the spring, his health was pronounced to be delicate. In the genial summer time, the accomplishment of the proposed visit would be impossible, for at that period the baroness expected to become a mother. Such were the apologies which Franval seemed almost glad to be able to send to his sisters in France. The marriage was, in the strictest sense of the term, a happy one. The baron, though he never altogether lost the strange restraint and reserve of his manner, was, in his quiet, peculiar way, the fondest and kindest of husbands. He went to town occasionally on business, but always seemed glad to return to the baroness. He never varied in the politeness of his bearing toward his wife's sister. He behaved with the most courteous hospitality toward all the friends of the Welwyns. In short, he thoroughly justified the good opinion which Rosamond and her father had formed of him when they first met at Paris. And yet no experience of his character thoroughly reassured Ida. Months passed on quietly and pleasantly, and still that secret sadness, that indefinable, unreasonable apprehension on Rosamond's account, hung heavily on her sister's heart. At the beginning of the first summer months a little domestic inconvenience happened, which showed the baroness, for the first time, that her husband's temper could be seriously ruffled, and that by the veriest trifle. He was in the habit of taking in 2 French provincial newspapers, one published at Bordeaux and the other at Havre. He always opened these journals the moment they came, looked at one particular column of each with the deepest attention for a few minutes, then carelessly threw them aside into his waste paper basket. His wife and her sister were at first rather surprised at the manner in which he read his 2 papers, but they thought no more of it when he explained that he only took them in to consult them about French commercial intelligence which might be occasionally of importance to him. These papers were published weekly. On the occasion to which I have just referred, the Bordeaux paper came on the proper day as usual, but the Havre paper never made its appearance. This trifling circumstance seemed to make the baron seriously uneasy. He wrote off directly to the country post office and to the newspaper agent in London. His wife, astonished to see his tranquillity so completely overthrown by so slight a cause, tried to restore his good humour by jesting with him about the missing newspaper. He replied by the first angry and unfeeling words that she had heard issue from his lips. She was then within about 6 weeks of her confinement, and very unfit to hear harsh words from anybody, least of all from her husband. On the 2nd day no answer came. On the afternoon of the 3rd the baron rode off to the post town to make inquiries. About an hour after he had gone, a strange gentleman came to the Grange and asked to see the baroness. On being informed that she was not well enough to receive visitors, he sent up a message that his business was of great importance and that he should wait downstairs for a second answer. On receiving this message, Rosamond turned, as usual, to her elder sister for advice. Ida went downstairs immediately to see the stranger. What I am now about to tell you of the extraordinary interview which took place between them, and of the shocking events that followed it, I have heard from Miss Welwyn's own lips. She felt unaccountably nervous when she entered the room. The stranger bowed very politely, and asked in a foreign accent if she were the Baroness Franval. She set him right on this point, and told him she attended to all matters of business for the Baroness, adding, if his errand at all concerned her sister's husband, the baron was not then at home. The stranger answered that he was aware of it when he called, and that the unpleasant business on which he came could not be confided to the baron, at least in the first instance. She asked why. He said he was there to explain, and expressed himself as feeling greatly relieved at having to open his business to her, because she would doubtless be able to prepare her sister for the bad news that he was, unfortunately, obliged to bring. The sudden faintness which overcame her as he spoke those words prevented her from addressing him in return. He poured out some water for her from a bottle which happened to be standing on the table, and asked if he might depend on her fortitude. She tried to say yes, but the violent throbbing of her heart seemed to choke her. He took a foreign newspaper from his pocket, saying that he was a secret agent of the French police, and that the paper was the Havre Journal for the past week, and that it had been expressly kept from reaching the baron, as usual, through his, the agent's, interference. He then opened the newspaper, and begged that she would nerve herself sufficiently, for her sister's sake, to read certain lines, which would give her some hint of the business that brought him there. He pointed to the passage as he spoke. It was among the shipping entries, and was thus expressed: "Arrived the Berenice from San Francisco, with a valuable cargo of hides. She brings one passenger, the Baron Franval, of Chateau Franval in Normandy." As Miss Welwyn read the entry, her heart, which had been throbbing violently but the moment before, seemed suddenly to cease from all action, and she began to shiver. though it was a warm June evening. The agent held the tumbler to her lips and made her drink a little of the water, entreating her very earnestly to take courage and listen to him. He then sat down and referred again to the entry, every word he uttered seeming to burn itself in forever, as she expressed it, on her memory and her heart. He said, "It has been ascertained beyond the possibility of doubt that there is no mistake about the names in the lines you have just read. And it is as certain as that we are here that there is only one Baron Franval now alive. The question, therefore, is, whether the passenger by the Berenice is the true Baron, or, I beg you most earnestly to bear with me and to compose yourself, or the husband of your sister. The person who arrived last week at Havre was scouted as an impostor by the ladies at the chateau. The moment he presented himself there as the brother, returning to them after 16 years of absence. The authorities were communicated with, and I and my assistants were instantly sent for from Paris. We wasted no time in questioning the supposed impostor. He either was or affected to be in a perfect frenzy of grief and indignation. We just ascertained from competent witnesses that he bore an extraordinary resemblance to the real Baron, and that he was perfectly familiar with places and persons in and about the chateau. We just ascertained that, and then proceeded to confer with the local authorities, and to examine their private entrées of suspected persons in their jurisdiction, ranging back over a period of 20 years or more. One of the entries thus consulted contained these particulars: Hector Auguste Montbrun, son of a respectable proprietor in Normandy, well educated, gentlemanlike manners, on bad terms with his family, character bold, cunning, unscrupulous, self-possessed, is a clever mimic, may be easily recognized by his striking likeness to the Baron Franval, imprisoned at 20 for theft and assault." Miss Welwyn saw the agent look up at her after he had read this extract from the police book, to ascertain if she was still able to listen to him. He asked, with some appearance of alarm, as their eyes met, if she would like some more water. She was just able to make a sign in the negative. He took a second extract from his pocket-book and went on. He said, "The next entry under the same name was dated 4 years later, and ran thus: H. A. Montbrun, condemned to the galleys for life, for assassination and other crimes not officially necessary to be here specified, escaped from custody at Toulon, is known, since the expiration of his first term of imprisonment, to have allowed his beard to grow, and to have worn his hair long, with the intention of rendering it impossible for those acquainted with him in his native province to recognize him, as heretofore, by his likeness to the Baron Franval. There were more particulars added, not important enough for extract. We immediately examined the supposed impostor, for if he was Montbrun, we knew that we should find on his shoulder the 2 letters of the convict brand T.F., standing for travaux forcés. After the minutest examination with the mechanical and chemical tests used on such occasions, not the slightest trace of the brand was to be found. The moment this astounding discovery was made, I started to lay an embargo on the forthcoming numbers of the Havre Journal for that week, which were about to be sent to the English agent in London. I arrived at Havre on Saturday, the morning of publication, in time to execute my design. I waited there long enough to communicate by telegraph with my superiors in Paris, then hastened to this place. What my errand is here, you may. He might have gone on speaking for some moments longer, but Miss Welwyn heard no more. Her first sensation of returning consciousness was the feeling that water was being sprinkled on her face. Then she saw that all the windows in the room had been set wide open to give her air, and that she and the agent were still alone. At first she felt bewildered, and hardly knew who he was, but he soon recalled to her mind the horrible realities that had brought him there, by apologizing for not having summoned assistance when she fainted. He said it was of the last importance in Franval's absence that no one in the house should imagine that anything unusual was taking place in it. Then, after giving her an interval of a minute or two to collect what little strength she had left, he added that he would not increase her sufferings by saying anything more just then on the shocking subject of the investigation which it was his duty to make, that he would leave her to recover herself, and to consider what was the best course to be taken with the Baroness in present terrible emergency, and that he would privately return to the house between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening, ready to act as Miss Welwyn wished, and to afford her and her sister any aid and protection of which they might stand in need. With these words he bowed, and noiselessly quit the room. For the first few awful minutes after she was left alone, Miss Welwyn sat helpless and speechless, utterly numbed in heart and mind and body. Then a sort of instinct, she was incapable of thinking, seemed to urge her to conceal the fearful news from her sister as long as possible. She ran upstairs to Rosamond's sitting room, and called through the door, for she dared not trust herself in her sister's presence, that the visitor had come on some troublesome business from their late father's lawyers, and that she was going to shut herself up and write some long letters in connection with that business. After she had got into her own room, she was never sensible of how time was passing, never conscious of any feeling within her, except a baseless, helpless hope that the French police might yet be proved to have made some terrible mistake, until she heard a violent shower of rain come on a little after sunset. The noise of the rain, and the freshness it brought with it in the air, seemed to awaken her as if from a painful and a fearful sleep. The power of reflection returned to her. Her heart heaved and bounded with an overwhelming terror, as the thought of Rosamond came back vividly to it. Her memory recurred despairingly to the long past day of her mother's death, and to the farewell promise she had made by her mother's bedside. She burst into a hysterical passion of weeping that seemed to be tearing her to pieces. In the midst of it she heard the clatter of a horse's hoofs in the courtyard, and knew that Rosamond's husband had come back. Dipping her handkerchief in cold water, and passing it over her eyes as she left the room, she instantly hastened to her sister. Fortunately, the daylight was fading in the old-fashioned chamber that Rosamond occupied. Before they could say 2 words to each other, Franval was in the room. He seemed violently irritated, said that he had waited for the arrival of the mail, that the missing newspaper had not come by it, that he had got wet through, that he felt a shivering fit coming on, and that he believed he had caught a violent cold. His wife anxiously suggested some simple remedies. He roughly interrupted her, saying there was but one remedy, the remedy of going to bed, and so left them without another word. She just put her handkerchief to her eyes, and said softly to her sister, "How he has changed!" then spoke no more. They sat silent for half an hour or longer. After that, Rosamond went affectionately and forgivingly to see how her husband was. She returned saying that he was in bed and in a deep, heavy sleep, and predicting hopefully that he would wake up quite well the next morning. In a few minutes more the clock struck 9, and Ida heard the servant's step ascending the stairs. She suspected what his errand was, and went out to meet him. Her presentiment had not deceived her. The police agent had arrived, and was waiting for her downstairs. He asked her if she had said anything to her sister, or had thought of any plan of action the moment she entered the room, and, on receiving a reply in the negative, inquired further if the Baron had come home yet. She answered that he had, that he was ill and tired and vexed, and that he had gone to bed. The agent asked in an eager whisper if she knew that he was asleep and alone in bed, and when he received her reply, said that he must go up into the bedroom directly. She began to feel the faintness coming over her again, and with it sensations of loathing and terror that she could neither express to others nor define to herself. He said that if she hesitated to let him avail himself of this unexpected opportunity, her scruples might lead to fatal results. He reminded her that if the Baron were really the convict Montbrun, the claims of society and of justice demanded that he should be discovered by the first available means, and that if he were not, if some unconceivable mistake had really been committed, then such a plan for getting immediately at the truth as was now proposed would ensure the delivery of an innocent man from suspicion, and at the same time spare him the knowledge that he had ever been suspected. This last argument had its effect on Mrs. Welwyn. The baseless, helpless hope that the French authorities might yet be proved to be in error, which she had already felt in her own room, returned to her now. She suffered the agent to lead her upstairs. He took the candle from her hand when she pointed to the door, opened it softly, and leaving it ajar, went into the room. She looked through the gap with a feverish, horror-struck curiosity. Franval was lying on his side in a profound sleep, with his back turned toward the door. The agent softly placed the candle upon a small reading table between the door and the bedside, softly drew down the bedclothes a little away from the sleeper's back, then took a pair of scissors from the toilet table, and very gently and slowly began to cut away, first the loose folds, then the intervening strips of linen from the part of Franval's nightgown that was over his shoulders. When the upper part of his back had been bared in this way, the agent took the candle and held it near the flesh. Miss Welwyn heard him ejaculate some word under his breath, then saw him looking round to where she was standing, and beckoning her to come in. Mechanically she obeyed. Mechanically she looked down where his finger was pointing. It was the convict Montbrun. There, just visible under the bright light of the candle, were the fatal letters T.F. branded on the villain's shoulder. Though she could neither move nor speak, the horror of this discovery did not deprive her of her consciousness. She saw the agent softly draw up the bedclothes again into their proper position, replace the scissors on the toilet table, and take from it a bottle of smelling salts. She felt him removing her from the bedroom, and helping her quickly downstairs, giving her the salts to smell to by the way. When they were alone again, he said, with the first appearance of agitation that he had yet exhibited, "Now, madame, for God's sake, collect all your courage and be guided by me. You and your sister had better leave the house immediately. Have you any relatives in the neighborhood with whom you could take refuge?" They had none. What is the name of the nearest town where you could get good accommodation for the night? Harleybrook. He wrote the name down on his tablets. How far off is it? 12 miles. You had better have the carriage out at once to go there with as little delay as possible, leaving me to pass the night here. I will communicate with you tomorrow at the principal hotel. Can you compose yourself sufficiently to be able to tell the head servant, if I ring for him, that he is to obey my orders till further notice? The servant was summoned, and received his instructions, the agent going out with him to see that the carriage was got ready quietly and quickly. Miss Welwyn went upstairs to her sister. How the fearful news was first broken to Rosamond I cannot relate to you. Miss Welwyn has never confided to me, has never confided to anybody, what happened at the interview between her sister and herself that night. I can tell you nothing of the shock they both suffered, except that the younger and the weaker died under it, that the elder and the stronger has never recovered from it and never will. They went away the same night, with one attendant to Harleybrook, as the agent had advised. Before daybreak, Rosamond was seized with the pains of premature labor. She died 3 days after, unconscious of the horror of her situation, wandering in her mind about past times, and singing old tunes that Ida had taught her as she lay in her sister's arms. The child was born alive, and lives still. You saw her at the window as we came in at the back way to the Grange. I surprise you, I dare say, by asking you not to speak of her to Miss Welwyn. Perhaps you noticed something vacant in the little girl's expression. I am sorry to say that her mind is more vacant still. If idiot did not sound like a mocking word, however tenderly and pityingly one may wish to utter it, I should tell you that the poor thing had been an idiot from her birth. You will doubtless want to hear now what happened at Glenwith Grange after Miss Welwyn and her sister had left it. I have seen the letter which the police agent sent the next morning to Harleybrook, and speaking from my recollection of that, I shall be able to relate all that you can desire to know. First, as to the past history of the scoundrel Monbrun, I need only tell you that he was identical with an escaped convict, who for a long term of years had successfully eluded the vigilance of the authorities all over Europe, and in America as well. In conjunction with 2 accomplices, he had succeeded in possessing himself of large sums of money by the most criminal means. He also acted secretly as the banker of his convict brethren, whose dishonest gains were all confided to his hands for safe keeping. He would have been certainly captured, on venturing back to France, along with his 2 associates, but for the daring imposture in which he took refuge, and which, if the true Baron Franval had really died abroad, as was reported, would in all probability never have been found out. Besides his extraordinary likeness to the baron, he had every other requisite for carrying on his deception successfully. Though his parents were not wealthy, he had received a good education. He was so notorious for his gentlemanlike manners among the villainous associates of his crimes and excesses, that they nicknamed him the Prince. All his early life had been passed in the neighborhood of the Chateau Franval. He knew what were the circumstances which had induced the baron to leave it. He had been in the country to which the baron had emigrated. He was able to refer familiarity to persons and localities at home and abroad, with which the baron was sure to be acquainted. And lastly, he had an expatriation of 15 years to plead for him as his all-sufficient excuse, if he made any slight mistakes before the baron's sisters, in his assumed character of their long-absent brother. It will be, of course, hardly necessary for me to tell you, in relation to this part of the subject, that the true Franval was immediately and honorably reinstated in the family rights of which the impostor had succeeded for a time in depriving him. According to Montbrun's own account, he had married poor Rosamond purely for love, and the probabilities certainly are that the pretty, innocent English girl had really struck the villain's fancy for the time, and that the easy, quiet life he was leading at the Grange pleased him, by contrast with his perilous and vagabond existence of former days. What might have happened if he had had time enough to grow wearied of his ill-fated wife and his English home, it is now useless to inquire. What really did happen on the morning when he awoke after the flight of Ida and her sister can be briefly told. As soon as his eyes opened, they rested on the police agent, sitting quietly by the bedside, with a loaded pistol in his hand. Montbrun knew immediately that he was discovered, but he never for an instant lost the self-possession for which he was famous. He said he wished to have 5 minutes allowed to him to deliberate quietly in bed whether he should resist the French authorities on English ground, and so gain time by obliging the one government to apply specially to have him delivered up by the other, or whether he should accept the terms officially offered to him by the agent, if he quietly allowed himself to be captured. He chose the latter course, it was suspected, because he wished to communicate personally with some of his convict associates in France, whose fraudulent gains were in his keeping, and because he felt boastfully confident of being able to escape again whenever he pleased. Be his secret motives, however, what they might, he allowed the agent to conduct him peaceably from the Grange, first writing a farewell letter to poor Rosamond, full of heartless French sentiment and glib sophistries about fate and society. His own fate was not long in overtaking him. He attempted to escape again, as it had been expected he would, and was shot by the sentinel on duty at the time. I remember hearing that the bullet entered his head and killed him on the spot. My story is done. It is 10 years now since Rosamond was buried in the churchyard yonder, and it is 10 years also since Miss Welwyn returned to be the lonely inhabitant of Glenwith Grange. She now lives but in the remembrances that it calls up before her of her happier existence of former days. There is hardly an object in the old house which does not tenderly and solemnly remind her of her mother, whose last wishes she lived to obey, of the sister whose happiness was once her dearest earthly care. Those prints that you noticed on the library walls, Rosamond used to copy in the pastime, when her pencil was often guided by Ida's hand. Those music books that you were looking over, she and her mother have played from together through many a long and quiet summer's evening. She has no ties now to bind her to the present but the poor child whose affliction it is her constant effort to lighten, and the little peasant population around her, whose humble cares and wants and sorrows she is always ready to relieve. Far and near her modest charities have penetrated among us, and far and near she is heartily beloved and blessed in many a laborer's household. There is no poor man's hearth, not in this village only, but for miles away from it as well, at which you would not be received with the welcome given to an old friend, if only you told the cottagers that you knew the lady of Glenwith Grange. End of section 27. Recording by Molly Craig.